I'm Jeremy Parrish, and this is Game Boy World. When Nintendo launched the Game Boy in Japan on April 21st, 1989, it came with a handful of video games. In hindsight, these games seem almost laughably simplistic, but it's important to keep in mind the context of the times and the kind of portable experiences that had been available until that time, which is to say, not very many. Before Game Boy, we had Game & Watch, we had Milton Bradley's Microvision, we had those little handheld LED games in the shape of whatever sports ball they were supposedly representing. But that was really about it. Even though Epyx's Handy had been developed in 1986 as a very impressive color handheld, it didn't actually launch until after the Game Boy. So the games that Nintendo published alongside the Game Boy were in fact the first real portable video games that offered a console-style experience. In that light, I think it's possible to forgive Alleyway for being a bit simplistic. Only 4 games appeared at the Japanese launch of Game Boy. There was Alleyway, there was Super Mario Land, there was Baseball, and there was a Mahjong game that never came to America called Yakuman. Tetris, which was a pack-in the US, didn't actually launch until several months later. So even though we think of Tetris as being an essential part of the Game Boy experience, and definitely its killer app, that wasn't the case for the original launch of the system. So without the killer app of Tetris, gamers had to settle for something that was, a little more watered down. Super Mario Land was pretty fun, and it was definitely the closest thing to a legitimate NES-style platformer that was available on any handheld system. But it was still much more primitive than Super Mario Bros. 3, which launched the year before in Japan and would follow the next year in America. Baseball was basically NES Baseball, which was hopelessly primitive by the time Game Boy launched in 1989. Yakuman was Mahjong, and there's not really too much you can do with that. And Alleyway was pretty much a breakout clone. But I don't think it's fair to excoriate Alleyway for being simplistic. Yes, Arkanoid had launched in 1986 from Taito in the arcades, and had already been available on the NES, and was a much, much more compelling take on the breakout clone style. But I think if you look at the Game Boy's earliest software as being sort of a transitional point from Game & Watch's simplistic handheld watch-style LCD games, and more the robust console-style experiences we expect from handhelds now, Alleyway's simplicity is a bit forgivable. And to some degree, Alleyway has its own roots in Nintendo's work. Back in the late 70s, Nintendo produced a series of standalone console-style TV games. They didn't have interchangeable carts, they were more like Pong clones from Sears. There were several of these, but probably the most famous was Block Kazushi, which is the Japanese term for block breaking or breakout clones. Block Kazushi was notable because not only was it a color system, its console was designed by Shigeru Miyamoto and was a really great looking device. I mean, it has a really nice curvature to it. The different game modes are clearly depicted in simple graphics, so there's no mystery about it. It's a very tactile, compelling, attractive piece of design. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Alleyway on the Japanese box also says Block Kazushi next to the title of the game. I really think Alleyway was meant to be a throwback to the original Block Kazushi that Nintendo published. And as such, the simplicity of its design was deliberate. It was imitating a decade-old game. So yes, even though Alleyway is pretty much a breakout clone, and it's black and white to boot, keep in mind the fact that coming off of Game & Watch, it was considerably more sophisticated. I don't know that Nintendo's developers really knew what they could do with the Game Boy hardware at the time, so what they did was create simple graphics, simple play experiences to see what would work, take the temperature of the market, and adjust from there. When Tetris worked out really well, what we got was a lot of puzzle games and Sokoban clones. Had Alleyway been a huge success, we probably would have seen a lot of breakout games. All of this isn't to say that Nintendo didn't have some ambition with Alleyway. It's not like it's just pure, simple breakout. Aside from the little obligatory Mario reference where he hops in and out of the paddle that you control, and also the puzzle arrangements in the shape of Mario sprites, Alleyway also mixes things up with some interesting gimmicks and variations on the basic playstyle. Basically, the game consists of 8 different sets of 4 rounds, and each round has its own different personality. The first round of a set is always just straightforward breakout, with different arrangements of blocks, but the basic rules, where a ball falls out, you hit it back and forth, breaking bricks with it, the ball becomes faster as you go, and you can put some English on the ball, so to speak, by hitting it at different points on the paddle. It'll fly at either 15, 30, or 45 degrees from your paddle. With the second round, things usually start to mix up a little bit. Bricks will start to move back and forth horizontally across the screen. Initially, this is pretty straightforward, but by the second set, the block patterns become increasingly complicated. Also, beginning in the second round, the paddle shrinks to half size once the ball hits the back wall of the court. For the third round of each set, the bricks actually march forward after the ball hits the paddle so many times, advancing one space at a time until they reach the bottom. So the challenge there becomes almost Space Invaders-like, in that you have to break away the bricks before they reach the bottom of the screen. And then the fourth round of each set is simply a bonus round, where the ball passes through bricks instead of bouncing off of them, and you're timed with about 60 seconds to clear away all the bricks. If you manage this, you'll get a huge bonus, which will take you most of the way to an extra life. If not, well, you get a few points. There's really not too much to Alleyway besides these four basic playstyles. It's a very simple game. And again, I think that's understandable given the vintage of the game and the fact that it was by far the most exciting and full-featured brick-breaking game on any handheld device. The Game & Watch couldn't handle anything nearly so nuanced, nor could any other handheld devices before this point. So, it's primitive, but you have to start somewhere. As a first-party Game Boy title, Alleyway also includes a special palette when you play it on Super Game Boy, which is what you see in this video. It's a set palette and there's no way to change it. It is always this color on Super Game Boy. As for the team behind this, it's hard to say. The game is alternately credited to Nintendo R&D 1 and Intelligent Systems, which are two teams within Nintendo, or were two teams within Nintendo, that had some relationship with one another, because Nintendo's early history isn't necessarily that well chronicled in terms of internal development and contractors and things like that, and there's no staff role in the game. It's impossible to say exactly who worked on this. But the game is listed on our Intelligent Systems website as a project they worked on, so it seems likely that they co-developed it with R&D 1, who were the people responsible for the hardware itself and for many of the early games. Actually, most of the notable games on Nintendo Game Boy came from R&D 1. So, in hindsight, Alleyway is okay. It won't blow your mind. It's not really worth playing and revisiting now, especially if you want to play it with save states where there's no challenge to it. But, as a simple diversion, it's good for killing 5 minutes. It actually becomes pretty tedious if you try to play through the entire thing in one setting. And it actually gets pretty hard, too. So, even if you're really good, unless you practice at it and get pretty lucky, your play session will probably last 20, 30 minutes at most, which is actually a really long time to be playing a Breakout clone. So, it's probably just as well. As far as launch day titles go, Alleyway is probably the most forgettable, aside from maybe Yakuman. It's definitely the least remarkable of the American launch titles, but it's still not terrible. It doesn't deserve the horrible reputation that it has. When it launched on 3DS Virtual Console, the reviewers raked it over the coals, but of course that was in the context of 2011 as opposed to 1989. In its time, it was fine. Nowadays, not so much. But again, baby steps. And this was Nintendo Game Boy's first baby step. For more on Game Boy's history, check out GameBoyWorld.com.